But I will move immediately to our panel of four respondents. And I'll introduce, first of all, Professor Alan Matthews. Alan is Professor Emeritus of European Agricultural Policy at TCD. He's former President of the European Association of Agricultural Economics and is, of course, currently a member of the Irish Climate Change Advisory Council. He is a well-known blogger on matters of agricultural policy issues, such as CAP reform. So, Alan, I'll hand it to you in the first instance. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Tom. And can I say, first of all, thank you for the invitation to participate in this panel discussion and to respond to the report that Charles has just presented. The report is focused on the effects of, or how we can use the Common Agricultural Policy better to improve water quality in Ireland. And the first point I want to raise is that in some ways it is rather strange that we think of using subsidies as a way of improving water quality. The Water Framework Directive lays emphasis on the polluter pays principle. And it might be worth just thinking a little bit about the relative role of regulation on the one hand, and the payments that farmers receive under the CAP and the way they might be redesigned, as Charles has suggested, as a way of incentivizing changes in farm practices to improve water quality as a result. So we're really here in the area of externalities. We have, of course, positive externalities that we want to encourage and to incentivize, which are underprovided by pure market circumstances. We also have negative externalities, where pollution would be an obvious example, where decision makers, farmers in particular, don't necessarily take into account the consequences of some of their farm practices because, in a sense, there's no price. There's no cost involved in terms of pollution. And what's interesting here is where we draw the dividing line. What is it that we should pay farmers to provide, and what is it that we expect farmers themselves, in a sense, to internalize in terms of their own decision making? And that baseline is essentially around the distribution of property rights in the environment. So, for example, when we think of water pollution, do we say that citizens have a right to high quality water, and that if farmers want to use that water in the sense that they must pay for it, or is it that farmers have a right to farm their land? The waterways are going through their land, and if we want clean water, then it's up to society to pay for that. Now that's putting it in a very abstract way, but it has very, very concrete implications. For example, if we want to introduce buffer strips as a way of slowing the transfer of nitrogen from fields into waterways. Is the provision of buffer strips something that we should compensate farmers for in terms of the loss of productive land, or is that something that farmers themselves should be required to put in place in order to protect the relevant water bodies? Charles, in his report, refers to sort of fencing of stock as a way of protecting water bodies. Again, is that something that we should pay farmers to do, for example, through common agricultural policy subsidies, or is that something that we expect farmers to put in place themselves? Or a third example, which I take from Denmark, where drinking water supplies come largely from groundwater. And there is a significant problem in terms of the seepage of pesticides through soils into the groundwater and contaminating that. So a number of local authorities have insisted that in the area around where they are drawing their groundwater supplies, that those farmers should in fact be prohibited from using pesticides on their crops. Again, that's something that refers to just a specific group of farmers. Should they be compensated for that? Or is that something that we expect them to bear the cost of in order to ensure high drinking water quality for consumers? So that is at the heart, I think, of a lot of the debates around how we can address issues of market failure, such as water pollution. And regulation, of course, is in place. And in particular, we have the good agricultural practices under the Nitrates Directive as an example of this. But society may well decide that they are still prepared to make payments or to subsidize the ending of polluting behavior for various reasons. It could be that the group affected for income distribution reasons. If they have relatively low incomes, it may be considered unfair to put the burden on that group. If there are co-benefits involved, that's another reason why you might be prepared to subsidize practices that will prevent pollution. But in this case, in Ireland, what I think the report highlights is that we have already in place a mechanism whereby we are transferring very significant sums of money to farmers. And the question raised is, could we redesign those payments in a way that we could actually get more effective use in terms of environmental outcomes, and particularly for our discussion this morning in terms of water quality? One of the points that Charles makes in his report is that the CAP, as we have known it so far, has been very uniform across the European Union, and that this one-size-fits-all approach doesn't necessarily work when it's translated into guidance or recommendations or indeed legislation that affects individual farms in different parts of the Union. And I think it's worth spending a few minutes just to think about what the new ideas, the new proposals for the CAP, which should have come into force next year, but for various reasons have been delayed. So we will not see them coming in until the beginning of 2023. But how those proposals could be used by bodies such as the Water Fóram to try to maximize the change that Charles has recommended and this movement towards a sort of public goods approach. So the basis for this new CAP, what the Commission is calling its new delivery model, is a shift from the old approach of compliance, of basically setting out in legislation very detailed rules and then checking whether member states and farmers follow those rules, to a more performance-based approach. So basically, the Commission is proposing 9 specific objectives for the Common Agricultural Policy. Member states will be given flexibility to draw up strategic plans which are supposed to identify what are the real needs under each of those 9 objectives. And 3 of these objectives address the environment. 1 of them addresses water issues specifically. So within these strategic plans, there will be in future a greater flexibility for member states to design the way they use their CAP money to address these environmental objectives. Related to this new approach, this new delivery model, the Commission is also proposing a revised so-called green architecture. So this refers to the instruments that are set out in the legislation, which member states can draw upon in order to design their CAP strategic plans. And there are four levels of this which are worth highlighting. First of all, of course, direct payments, the Pillar 1 payments that are make up the bulk of these payments. One of the issues that has been raised repeatedly by environmental groups in Ireland is that often land which is highly valued from the point of view of biodiversity and possibly also in terms of low input land and therefore not giving rise to pollution, that this is not eligible for payments. And there does appear to be a willingness at the Brussels level to address this issue and to give greater flexibility to define these so-called non-productive areas as eligible areas for the purposes of CAP payments. So that, I think, is a positive, a possible positive outcome from the new CAP. The second element in this so-called green architecture is what farmers would know as cross-compliance, which the Commission has labeled as a enhanced conditionality. And the key thing here are the obligations that farmers must observe in order to be eligible for their CAP payments. The two basic requirements are observing the requirements of the Water Framework Directive and in particular the Nitrates Directive, so the good agricultural practice conditions that the department establishes. And there are also two what are called good agricultural and environmental condition standards, so-called GAIAC standards, which are also relevant to water quality, the requirement to establish buffer strips along water courses, and a new proposal from the Commission that all farmers, as part of their eligibility for direct payments, should make use of a so-called farm sustainability tool for nutrients. So basically a tool for nutrient management planning. In Ireland, we require that for farmers that avail of the derogation from the Nitrates Directive and also for farmers that are enrolled in GLAS. But the Commission would see this as an essential tool for all farmers. Although as the discussions in Brussels proceed, because of course this new CAP has not yet been agreed finally, it is possible that that provision will not remain in the final package. But there is scope there in terms of defining these cross compliance, these so-called enhanced conditionality conditions, to try to ensure that there is a high baseline of requirements for farmers before they receive their payments. In terms of the payments themselves, and the third innovation in terms of this green architecture is precisely as Charles has suggested, to make more use of the Pillar 1 payments to achieve environmental and climate objectives. And these are so-called eco schemes. Again, because we haven't seen the final outcome, we don't know quite how important these eco schemes will be. There are proposals to ring fence either 20 or 30% as a minimum for of the direct payments for these eco schemes. But basically, these will be voluntary for farmers, where they can enroll and, in a sense, get a higher payment for practices which improve the environment, including water quality, which go beyond the mandatory minimum that is part of the enhanced conditionality. So the design of those eco schemes and what we in Ireland put into our national strategic plan with respect to how these could be used to improve water, I think is going to be very important. And then the fourth element of this so-called green architecture are the well-known agri-environment climate schemes, which we've had financed as part of Pillar 2. There's a long history of these in Ireland, going back to the REP scheme, EOS, and most recently GLAS, where the evaluation suggests that we could make more effective use of the funding there if we were to move towards a more results-based approach. And indeed, Charles has recommended that in his report. So what I'm suggesting is that there are potential possibilities. We don't know the final shape of the CAP legislation, but we do know that member states will be given a lot of flexibility to draw up their own strategic plans to address these 9 specific objectives. And as I say, one of them is water. There will be an expectation that member states will set targets for these various specific objectives. Specifically for water, and it's maybe not the best target, and this is again something that perhaps the Water Fórum could look at. The impact indicator for improving water quality is the gross nutrient balance on agricultural land. So in other words, the nitrogen surplus, phosphorus surplus, which one would have a target that should be decreasing over time, given the link between that indicator and the potential for water pollution. So the question would be, how ambitious will the Irish government be in terms of setting targets for that indicator? So to conclude, I think there is potential. As I say, we don't know yet the final outcome for the CAP. There is potential to make use of it, to be more ambitious with respect to environmental and climate objectives, including water quality. And I think it'll be really important for bodies like the Water Fórum to follow closely the public consultations on this issue and to try to ensure as ambitious and effective use of these resources in the coming period. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alan. I think that presents an optimistic view of the possibilities that are currently there in terms of optimizing water quality returns from the new CAP. And of course, I'll just remind people attending that the poll is still out there. Our next respondent is Professor John Fitzgerald. John will be known to many of us, of course, as an erudite commentator in the Irish Times every week. He is also an honorary fellow of Trinity College Dublin, an assistant professor at School of Electrical and Electronic Engineering in UCD. And John is also chair of the Irish Government's Climate Change Advisory Council. He is, of course, former research professor at the Economic and Social Research Institute. So it gives me great pleasure, John, to ask you to take your opportunity to respond to Charles' paper, to make your commentary.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation. I suppose today we're concerned about how to protect our water courses from pollution, in particular the main source of pollution in Ireland, which is agriculture. And I'm just reiterating what Alan said. There are 2 key policy levers when you're talking about agricultural pollution. There's regulation and taxes and subsidies, which is the CAP. And taxes and subsidies work well where the pollution, wherever it occurs, has the same impact. For example, emissions of methane or carbon dioxide and its effect on climate change. It doesn't matter where it occurs, it has the same impact. However, when you come to water, the pollution there, depending on where you apply your nitrates and how close you are to the water and so on, it's very different. And regulation tends to be better at dealing with more localized issues than global issues. My primary concern, obviously, is tackling climate change. However, there are likely to be significant co-benefits in terms of the wider environment, health and biodiversity from many of the measures that need to be undertaken. So there's a potential win-win here. We are particularly concerned with emissions from agriculture of NOx and methane, two gases. And methane disappears after 10 years in the atmosphere, but NOx is there forever, effectively. And we need to substantially reduce the application of fertilizer, which is one of the big contributors to emissions of NOx. And if we're to tackle global warming. And Teagasc has shown that the use of different kind of fertilizer, say protected urea, could make a significant reduction. And we can achieve the change in different ways. A reduction in fertilizer will reduce water pollution. But water pollution may be best tackled by enforcement of regulations at the local level. But definitely there will be knock-on benefits if we reduce fertilizer application. We need to reduce cattle numbers, and Brexit makes a reduction in beef inevitable because farmers make nothing out of beef on average. And if we shift production to trees, bioenergy crops, farmers can make more money and a more secure income. So that by recalibrating the cap, farmers' incomes can probably be made more secure, and there would be a significant benefit in terms of sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. But Charles's report talks about the risks perceived with woodland or forestry by farmers. I think this is a problem that needs to be tackled. What are farmers' problems? And talk to the farming community about it. Talking to them, one of the things is the licensing rules, which seem to me mad, that we rely on regulation rather than licensing, in that farmers are concerned that if they plant trees, they will then have to apply for a license to chop them down and return to normal agriculture. As Charles makes the point, returning land which has had trees to agriculture is very difficult. So having restrictions which are unnecessary on farming, we need to look at what are the obstacles which are not just financial to farmers changing what they do. Reduction in fertilizer use will impact on dairying and the intensity there, which will have knock-on effects in terms of water. Now, changing the incentives in the CAP will play an important role along the lines of what's happening in the UK, as Charles has talked about. But it is instructive to look at that the UK decided they were going down the route of just paying farmers for environmental benefits. This was decided. Dieter Helm published a paper in August 2016 after the Brexit referendum. And this has been the guide as to where they are going. But they've just published the bill, but it doesn't actually tell you how they're going to structure the incentives. So even after 4 years, they haven't worked out how to do this. So it is not simple to redesign the CAP to achieve environmental benefits. And we need to think this through and do it in a way that it will actually work for farmers and work for administrators. One of the things that I think Charles early in his report talks about farmers being required to set aside 25% of their land for biodiversity or whatever. However, how you enforce this, and it depends on the land, it doesn't seem, that seems to be a crude way of going about this. So we need to pay for taking carbon out of the atmosphere, trees and energy crops, and management of peatland. And management of peatland is something that today is not something that the CAP deals with. But I think that we need, it's very important as a way of absorbing and holding carbon from the atmosphere. So we need to look at that. So redesigning the CAP, very important, but how you do this is not that easy. And it needs to be administratively operable. The Department of Agriculture must be able to operate it. But yeah, they'll think about their problems, but it must work for farmers too. If compliance is even more difficult than today, then it is not going to work. So we must think about the schemes in terms of the users. We're going to incentivize more environmentally desirable behavior by farmers, but how can we do it in a way that is verifiable and that farmers find easy to comply with? It also, we may need to add in some national funds, for example, for managing peat. And we may need other measures to help develop secure markets. For example, Charles identifies the problem in terms of markets for if farmers grow more trees, will there be a market for the product in the end? And farmers have been, they have concerns, say in the beef area, with only 1 or 2 buyers, that they may be over a barrel. So how do you develop markets for alternatives which are environmentally favorable? And that's not something that the cap on its own can address. I have 3 additional points. Research and development is important in this area, and it will changing the impact of agriculture and land use on the environment. In terms of climate change in particular, it must be verifiable. So, for example, if additives are found which will allow cattle to be reared and produce much less methane, and there is research which suggests that that's a long-term possibility, how do you know if farmers sign up to this, how do you know that the farmers are implementing the policy? Because you can't meter the methane coming off the cattle. And how do you know that the cattle, even if the farmers have bought the additive, that the cattle are taking their medicine? It's difficult enough with children. With cattle, and you cannot. So if you say we're going to be really green and we're not going to produce methane, you've got to be able to verify this, because if you can't verify it, then you can't count the benefit. So the verifiability of, there may be things that we need to do and which we can do, which are good for the environment, not just in terms of climate change, but in terms of water. But it must be verifiable and also administratively feasible, both for the farmers and the people checking it. There's one other area which I found intriguing in terms of water and not in terms of climate, where research is being done on a farm using LiDAR, where you can trace where the water is seeping through the land. And by planting hazel or willow at the point where the water is seeping out of the land into the water courses, you may be able to suck up the additive. So there may be actually cheap ways of reduce, but how you make farmers take account of this and reduce their emissions to water, also difficult. But research here is throwing up new solutions. The EU agricultural support, one thing which I would take issue with Charles on, and he says the EU agricultural support scheme is a cheap food policy. Actually, since 1956, the EU agricultural support scheme has been an expensive food policy. It deliberately, that the agriculture prices are higher within the EU because of protections from imports from outside. So that when he talks about the distributional effects of changes, I think distribution, it affects the incomes of farmers, but in terms of the wider community, I think that is a distraction. But to end up, I think that what the paper is very useful in signaling how the CAP is going to change, needs to change, and how it can benefit the environment as well as benefiting farmers in the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. And you just presented us with one more problem, which is to establish that the cattle are taking their medicine, which is yet another matter that I think we will have some interesting discussion on. But again, just an interesting contribution. I think that last point as to whether we have a cheap food policy or not is a particularly interesting observation in the context of Charles' overall paper. Our next presenter is Leanne Jackson. who is the head of the Agri-Food Trade and Markets Division in the Trade and Agriculture Directorate of the OECD. Leanne joined the OECD in 2020 after 16 years at the World Trade Organization, where her most recent position was as Counselor of Food and Agricultural Policy Research in the Economic Research and Statistics Division. Dr. Jackson was previously Secretary of the WTO's Committee on Agriculture in the Agriculture and Commodities Division, and is obviously Dr. Jackson is in a unique position to look at Charles' paper from what is happening on a global scale. So I'll hand it to you now, Leanne. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Tom. It's such a pleasure to be here and to be part of this dialogue, which I can see is a very productive way of engaging on these issues. So maybe as you set it up, to put this in a global perspective, we know that the world is facing massive environmental challenges, and part of that is ensuring the health and sustainability of water resources, which is what we're focusing on today. We know that agriculture contributes to some of the challenges, but we also know that agriculture can be part of the solution. And the question is how to get the policies right so that we can achieve the objectives that the world is looking for from agricultural and food systems. So my remarks are really picking up on this food systems theme that Charles was referring to several times in his remarks that kicked off this webinar. We have at the OECD a very large research project that's looking at food systems. And essentially it starts with this observation that what we expect from food systems is that they address a triple challenge, a massive triple challenge. So the food system is expected to provide sufficient, safe and nutritious food for the world. And we know the population is expected to approach 10 billion in 2050. And at the same time, the food system is expected to provide incomes to more than 500 million farmers around the world, and also to other actors along the food chain, and also to promote rural development. And of course, all of this is supposed to happen while making sure that the environment is not destroyed or harmed. So it should be done, these other objectives need to be done while making sure we're doing it sustainably. By using less land and less water and adapting to climate change issues. Charles in his remarks also highlighted this issue of the fact that there's no silver bullet. And that is really clear from the work that we've been doing also on food systems. There's such a diversity of conditions, environmental conditions, economic conditions, social conditions, that one type of policy approach is not going to be suited for all those conditions. So we're looking at complex policy questions. And when we're looking at that, we probably need to be thinking about a policy package of tools. So there's not going to be one type of policy that's going to get us to address the full triple challenge. And one of the areas that we've spent quite a bit of time on is thinking about what does it mean to have a coherent policy package. And I've heard both Alan, John, and Charles talk about how with different policies, you create trade-offs among and across different stakeholder groups, but there might also be synergies. So you can have policies that work in opposite directions, or you can have policies that are sort of pulling together to get towards better outcomes. But this requires, in order to have coherent policies, it requires a lot of coordination. And information. So one of the other main roles of the work in agriculture at the OECD is monitoring agricultural policies. And you, most of the speakers probably know this well. We do an annual monitoring of ag policies every year. And across the 54 OECD and non-OECD members that we monitor, this past report showed that farmers are receiving more than $700 billion US dollars per year in public support, and more than half of this is going in ways that are that create higher prices for consumers, and through payments that are coupled to production, including variable input subsidies like subsidies for fertilizer. And we know that these types of measures can be particularly detrimental. They can have negative environmental impacts, and we've heard previous speakers also mention this. So the question is, how do we put together a policy package that can manage these trade-offs? And one of the issues is maybe to identify the full toolkit of policies, and then make sure that you actually examine how these policies move us towards or away from addressing the triple challenges. Finally, another idea that the OECD is regularly talking about is shifting agricultural support towards policies that are focusing on longer term objectives. And again, previous speakers have mentioned this. If you're looking for a sustainable, productive, resilient food system, the types of measures that might be better suited towards getting to those long-term objectives are things like investments in research, investments in people and skilling people up, investments in infrastructure so that new technologies can be better used to address these triple challenges. So what makes it so complicated really is that we have spillover effects across the different stakeholder groups. So we're looking at the impacts on farmers. We also want to make sure we're thinking about environmental impacts, and something that we haven't really had that much discussion today is what's the final impact on consumers, also in terms of access to food and access to healthy food, which is a big part of the food system debate. I had three themes that jumped out at me when I read the report that I would just like to comment on, having to do with measurement and data, having to do with how do we transform our policy system, and finally, this question of stakeholder engagement in order to make sure that we can move our policies in the right direction. I thought that Charles's report did a nice job about noting where the data gaps are related to environmental issues. And obviously this is really important if you're a policymaker who needs to be calibrating policies to try to make sure that the public resources are actually achieving what would be seen as a more optimal outcome for the planet and for the people on the planet. But how do we measure public goods? We have to figure out how to think about these trade-offs and synergies, and it's across a wide variety of objectives. So part of the challenge with measurement and with our data gaps is how do we link across the different data sources? And this is really a big issue for food systems because we know that in a lot of situations, a lot of governments, policy making is siloed by ministry, for example. So it comes down to very concrete questions about how do you get policymakers to work across their silos? How do you make sure that the data that is necessary for measuring outcomes and calibrating policies can speak to each other? So the data that's collected by the Ministry of Agriculture can actually speak to the data that's being collected by the Environment Ministry. So that can be quite a large challenge. In terms of this question of transformation, one of the things that the work at the OECD highlighted is it's useful to think about the kinds of frictions to transforming policies in three different categories. You can have disagreements about facts, you can have disagreements about interests, and you can have disagreements about values. At the OECD, we've done lots of work in terms of collecting facts and evidence, but we still don't necessarily fully understand how the value piece fits into policy transformation. And it can be that differences in values, so you can take an example like GMOs, where some people think that GMOs can be the solution because they increase the productivity on agriculture and that's going to make sure that we have enough food for the growing population. Other people think that really, as a matter of a value, you shouldn't be changing the genetic composition of plants. So you're not really necessarily going to be able to bridge that difference just by providing facts. You have to actually acknowledge those value differences and engage in a dialogue, which I'll get to towards the end of my remarks. And so I talked about measurement and data, and then this question about facts, interests, and values, and how they can affect how we think about transforming policies. And the last thing I wanted to note was this, the theme of stakeholder engagement, and obviously that's why we're here today. A lot of our work shows that this is really important in terms of figuring out how to achieve a good balance in the policy package. Charles's report highlighted the importance of peer-to-peer learning, knowledge exchange, in order to make sure that the knowledge is passed between producers, for example, about what the best way is to actually be implementing policies. Events like this, where we're sharing information and perspectives, can help cross understanding and a dialogue, but we actually need to keep investing in these kinds of dialogues, because we need to have a habit of trying to bridge differences and collaborate across these differences. I had one comment I wanted to make on a recommendation that was in the end of the report. There was a comment about an interest in looking at shortening supply chains. And this year, this has been a real theme due to the COVID disruptions around the world. And we at the OECD, we've done some analysis about what that would look like, what the implications are of trying to move towards shortened value chains. So we did a modeling exercise, and actually, if you look at a system where governments are actually actively trying to shorten supply chains by breaking linkages with input suppliers, for example, from other countries. In fact, those kinds of situations make an economy more vulnerable to shocks, because the trade and the imports that are coming in across the border aren't available if the domestic economy suffers a shock. So what ends up happening is there tends to be a higher price impact for consumers and a contraction in production, because agricultural production is less able to switch into new composition of inputs due to the inflexibility of land and water resources, for example. So I think that this is a great opportunity today to get into this dialogue and to think about what would be necessary to actually make sure that we're creating food systems that can address this triple challenge, and also to think about how support to agriculture could be shifted off of these kinds of policies that are creating trade distorting and market distorting incentives, and more towards support for longer term objectives like sustainability, resilience, and productivity in the agricultural sector. So thank you very much. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Leanne. I think your point around facts, interests, and values is extraordinarily interesting in the way, in fact, in the way in which the Fóram is attempting to operate. I generally find people, interestingly enough, when it comes to stakeholder Fóram, can find it easy enough to share values. They might contest the facts, and they will definitely contest the interests. I am sometimes reminded of a central bank report in Ireland, which was published in 1975, which observed that we are all agreed that we need to make sacrifices. What we can't agree on is who is going to make them. And in some senses, the Fóram spends a lot of its time wondering who is going to make the sacrifices. So on that note, Michele, that's not in any sense setting your presentation up in any particular way, but I want to introduce Michele McCormack, who is with Teagasc. She joined Teagasc in 2012 and working in the socioeconomic research domain with Teagasc agricultural catchments since 2017. Michele's research interests includes environmental economics, particularly the relationship between agricultural production, farmer behaviour, and water quality. So it's obviously of a uniquely relevant research domain to the debate we're having. So Michele, I'll hand you the microphone. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Tom, and to follow on from a very high-level debate this morning and some great topics that have been brought up by everybody. I think my contribution this morning is to bring maybe a practical element and maybe the farmer's perspective in a little ways. So the program that I work with is the Agricultural Catchments program. It's been in place for over 10 years, and it's a multidisciplinary research team that includes a soil scientist, a hydrochemist, the economist, myself. I guess we're adding gaseous emissions element to the program going forward, and we're backed up by data technologists and technicians and KT specialists who work with almost 300 farmers in 6 different catchments. And these are our working farms. So these farmers, they voluntarily participate with the program, and they allow their data to be collected from their farms. So for this morning, I have been asked to comment on my assessment of farmers' willingness and their capacity to adopt some or any of the recommendations in the report. But first, I just wanted to comment on the statement that's been making the rounds for the last number of years, and public money for public goods, and both John and Alan have commented on it as well. And just for the non-economists who are listening in this morning, there's nothing new about public money for public goods. Public money has always provided public goods. And as economists, we probably have a very clear definition of what public goods are, and Charles mentioned it earlier on, and this idea of rivalry and non-excludability. So for those of us who may not fully understand those comments, and I myself, I'd say when I started to look into public goods way back in the day, found the concept very difficult. So we think about public goods. So when we talk about non-excludability, it means that if the good is provided, then nobody can be excluded from the benefits. And the rivalry side is that if I consume some of the good, it doesn't mean that there's any less for anybody else. So in this regard, if you think of street lighting, if street lighting is provided, it's there for everybody. We can't be excluded from using it by using up some of it. So traditionally, public goods included things like infrastructure and lighthouses, bridges, roads, and defence forces. And public goods has and always has been an economic rationale for the existence of governments in the first place. So, and Charles mentioned it earlier as well, traditional public goods gave rise to a problem we call free riding. And everybody in some way has experience of this. Maybe we all worked in some sort of a group project at some stage where somebody wasn't pulling their weight, or so it's a natural phenomenon. So what is new enough is that we're starting to recognize that there are a whole range of public goods which farmers for generations have provided, so and free of charge through an agri-environmental channel, if you like, and they arise as a byproduct of their farming practices. And it's new enough within this concept to think that we would pay individuals to provide public goods. So, for example, in Ireland, we're famous for our beautiful landscapes. Landscapes are man-made, and they have evolved over many generations. So when tourists come to the west of Ireland to see the beautiful stone walls, the economic benefits don't accrue to the farmers who have, built these stone walls over many, many generations, but the benefits accrue to tourist agencies and all the different service providers, but not farmers. So from an agriculture perspective, agri-environmental public goods are provided through a number of different channels. And I think this is very important. So the agri-environmental public goods come through channels like farmland biodiversity, soil quality and functionality, climate stability through carbon storage, rural vitality, food security, landscapes, and water quality. And the public goods which accrue to the wider society are things like public health and well-being and safety and security. And like we've said before, how do we measure these things, or how do we put a price on them, and how do we pay for them? So if we now decide that farmers should be rewarded for their part in providing these sort of public goods through agri-environmental schemes, we need to be very cognizant of the fact that the characteristics of these different channels through which the specific actions of farmers can provide benefits to the wider society are very different. And some of these channels are more favourable to the adoption of an agri-environmental scheme, for example, than others. So, for example, two very successful schemes that were mentioned in Charles' report this morning, the Burren Life Project and the Bride Project. The Burren Life Project focuses on landscapes. and the BRIDE project focuses on the biodiversity. So we could argue that these channels are more fixed, in that the actions carried out by the farmer on that farm has an effect on that particular place. And that means that the changes are more easily observable, and which means the targets can be put in place and results can be measured. And that's very important for any of the agri-environmental schemes that we're talking about coming down the line, that they need to be targeted, and that they need to be verifiable, they need to be able to measure them, and we need to be able to show results for the money that we're going to spend on them. On the other hand, for a diverse and, pardon the pun, a fluid channel like water quality, the results of the measures depend not only on the individual measures that are carried out by the farmer, but on all those others, the other actors whose actions also have an impact on the very same water. So we pay a farmer to implement measures on his farm, but that water is only flowing through, it's only passing through. So how do we measure how do we target those measures, and how do we measure them, and how do we see the benefits from them? So from my own research, and we have surveyed farmers about different mitigation measures and about their motivations for farming and all these different issues. So what we can say from our own data is that farmers are very willing to adopt mitigation measures when it comes to water quality, and particularly measures that just require a change in a management practice that has already been carried out on their farm. And farmers are less favourable to measures which involve additional costs. So for example, farmers would be more open to measures such as not applying fertilizers with high P content on areas that already are high in phosphorus, or not applying fertilizers to areas that are at high risk of nutrient loss. And these are just adapting practices that are already in place because they already apply fertilizer to the farms. So other mitigation measures like resiting of gateways, or establishing riparian buffer strips along water courses, or use of different slurry methods of applying slurry, they're less popular, and they incur a cost, an additional cost for the farmers. But we say the least popular of all in this survey that we carried out was establishing and maintaining artificial wetlands. And of course, it comes back to, you know, what Alan was saying earlier on. Are we paying farmers to supply goods, or are we asking them to give up part of what their productive land is, and back to property rights and so forth? So within the program that I work on, other scientific research has highlighted that there is also a role that the soil type on the farm plays, and weather conditions. So that the farmer behavior and the farmer adoption of different mitigation measures is only one part of an overall of the overall story. But we do have, and John, I think you mentioned the LiDAR capabilities. We do have the capabilities to match the different mitigation measures which scientists, and coming from research and coming from evidence-based research, we do have the capabilities to match different mitigation measures to the critical source areas. And funding for these measures are provided, if funding for these measures is provided through voluntary agricultural schemes, and all of the agricultural schemes, including GLAS, they've all been voluntary. So there is no guarantee that the farmers that we want to target for those particular critical source areas will participate. And I think in the long run, this could prove costly exercises without providing any positive results for water quality outcomes if the particular critical source area that we need the mitigation measures to go into are not the farmers who are willing to participate in the voluntary program. So I'll just finish up and say that public money for public goods, it sounds very neat and plausible, but public good provision through agri-environmental channels can be difficult, and a lot of care should be taken in holding agri-environmental schemes up as an answer to this very difficult and complex question. So thank you very much.